Hi everyone, welcome to the very last video lecture of this course. I want to touch on something that you've probably been reading a lot about in the news, on social media, which is AI. AI and generative AI in particular is currently touching all domains of creativity, of work, of business. So I want to kind of focus our discussion on music and sort of how can we think about these things? How can we integrate them into our classrooms if that's something that we want to do? How can we, get young musicians to use these things as tools on a more granular level that enhance human creativity rather than replace it? So where are the innovations? What are the companies and products that are allowing for musicians and music learners to explore music in new ways rather than just type in a prompt and receive a fully completed piece of music, and sort of breaking down that relationship between creativity and music? So let's dive in. I want to kind of ground our discussion sort of in the background and context, of what my experience has been in this area, what kind of informs my perspectives on this area. So as a media composer, I write music that I feel is very vulnerable to AI, right? When we listen to a song by an artist that we love, we're very much attached to that artist's identity, right? Taylor Swift is a great example of this. People love her just as much as they love her music, or an artist like Kendrick Lamar, right? We can think about the artist and identity as really intertwined, even smaller underground bands, right? But when you're listening to music in a TV show, you're not really necessarily thinking about, well, who is that composer and what is their identity? Or even in a commercial, right? Or in a film, right? You might think about it, particularly you, right, as a music teacher, a musician, but your average public is not too concerned about who wrote the music, as long as it works and it kind of hits the right emotional notes, right? So these are areas where AI might make the most inroads in the most quickly, sort of music that's functional music. So I started to think about this back in 2019. I wrote a paper when I was doing my dissertation on technorealism in music towards a balanced view of artificial intelligence and musical composition. I've worked in consultation with some of my colleagues, a New York City-based film composer, a music library, develop an AI strategy. How can they integrate AI into their existing workflows to help them create music more quickly, and also sort of more based on client needs? So how to leverage one's music library as a composer to come up with new ideas based on that. In practice, I've just been exploring these tools. I think it's incredibly interesting that we live in these times, that we have access to these things, and I think they're worth exploring. Whether or not you think they're good or bad, I think they're worth evaluating and giving a critical lens to. And education. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've been teaching these things here at WCU, and maybe how that can inform your approaches with how you're talking to your students and working with your students on these subjects. So more specifically, I want to introduce Open Labs 2024, which I ran in the spring of 2024. I thought this stuff is moving so quick, and it's going to be so long before I can get something approved by the curriculum committee and into a course. So I used my office hours and the Center for Music Technology, which is our lab, our sort of music technology lab at Westchester, as an environment, and I was able to sort of create these sessions where students could drop in to one or two or three, or to all of them. We could check out these technologies together in sort of hands-on demos and have discussions around sort of the ethical, legal implications of AI, all that kind of stuff. I also ran at the end, any student that was more than two sessions, we ran some survey, and at the end of this lecture, we'll take a look at some of those survey results. I found them quite interesting. So the purpose and goals of my open labs were, thinking about that sort of dichotomy between music education evolving gradually and AI technology advancing year over year, month over month. The rise of generative AI output poses pressing challenges and opportunities for musicians. Both of those at the same time. There's opportunities and there's challenges, particularly in the next coming years as these things continue to advance. Provide guidance, right? Separating facts from noise around generative AI and the creative arts. We can think about the news sources that students use. It's a lot of social media, and I wanted to sort of bring in maybe some peer-reviewed research papers from conferences, and also just having more face-to-face discussions, right? Sort of emotional alignment between students and figuring out ways of how to navigate these things. And sort of a sandbox thinking. I love this idea of, let's try things out. Let's have an informal setting. Students are often feel overburdened with the amount of work they have to do in all of their courses. So why not make it a setting where there's no assignments, there's no homework, but we are going to really dive in and critically engage with the material. So before we sort of go any further, we're talking about the musical applications. I want to just give some framework and some background, just to provide some general vocabulary to you all to kind of when we're talking about generative AI. So often we talk about this most outer level, right? Artificial intelligence or AI. And this is a term that's actually been around since the late 1950s, and it's the idea of like a general, um, a broad field of machines doing intelligent things, typically human type tasks. Um, so that's sort of the oldest and broadest category. There's lots of ways to do AI. There's rule-based AI, and we'll get into some of these other approaches here. Machine learning is a subset of AI in which the algorithm learns patterns from data without being explicitly programmed. So this is one of the real big breakthroughs of AIs is that early models were just trying to teach, for example, teaching a computer to write counterpoint by teaching it the rules of counterpoint, which is great. But if you wanted to then write more advanced music that is written for instruments or has any kind of rhythmic complexity, it won't be able to do that because it only learned that rules of that one specific style of music. With machine learning, you give the computer the data without necessarily giving it specific instructions on what it should be looking for. You allow it to find its own patterns and associations. And then this is moving into the 1990s now, and in the early 2000s, the idea of deep learning is a specialized form of machine learning that uses neural networks with multiple layers or deep neural networks to process complex patterns and large amounts of data. So that deep learning is basically using these neural networks to take a lot of data. The classic example is image recognition. Right, so you feed a computer a lot of pictures of different things, of cats, and eventually it's able to take a piece of data that it hasn't seen before and say if there is or is not a cat in that picture. So that's when we get to deep learning. Now, in the early 2020s, there's some breakthroughs in sort of flipping that around, right? You fed the computer all of these images of cats, and now you're not asking it anymore to say if there is a cat or not. You're saying, hey, can you also just generate me a new cat picture? And can you make it a brown cat? And can it be standing on a table? So that's where we get into generative AI, where you flip deep learning inside out and where you're not just looking for patterns, pattern recognition, but you're saying create something based on the patterns that you've observed, right? And that can be applied to any domain. That could be applied to text or images. There's some examples with things like Sora or Google's VO. These are new emerging video, and then we'll look at specifically in music. So that's the idea of generative AI. So generative AI is nested in all of these layers, but a lot of times in common talk we'll just say AI. But it's important to understand those layers that are nested inside this idea of generated AI. So in Open Labs, the primary technologies that we were looking at were things that create novel outputs. We were focused on generative AI. The focus was applications that create or process music, either MIDI or audio, and we kind of broke it down into these four areas. Now, in this module, we'll be taking a look at three of these areas: at the stem separation, audio and music generation, and timbre transfer. I gave you some links also for some MIDI generation. If any of you use BandLab, BandLab is one of the softwares that has a song starter idea that relies on some generative MIDI capabilities there. Yeah, there are also tools like ChatGPT, or DALL-E or Midjourney that could be used by musicians to create artwork or to create lyrics. So when you're talking to your students, you're not necessarily limited to these technologies. You could be using AI in a more complementary way. So it's not creating the music, but it's creating the things that musicians need, particularly, either on the tech side of the lyrics or on the sort of marketing and visual side of creating album artwork. So lots of possibilities there, but we're looking at specifically at the sort of music generative aspects. First, let's look at generative audio. So if you've ever used DALL-E or Midjourney or anything to generate an image, you're probably familiar with this process that you'd use here, right? You give it a bunch of terms, keywords, and then it gives you a piece of music back. So these models that do this are trained on vast libraries of audio recordings, including full songs, isolated instrument tracks, and sound effects. Generative audio applications create new audio files, which could be the same. They could be full songs or instrumental compositions or single instrument samples like a bass line or a drum beat. The user controls the output through text prompts and audio examples. So here's an example. This is Stable Audio. Stable Audio is part of Stability, and they created a generative audio engine where you could create up to 3 minutes of audio, or this could be sound effects or music. And they've trained it off of two sources. One is freesound.org and one is Spark Tracks, which is a music library. So it's either been copyright free examples or music that's been licensed. We'll look at some other ones who have sort of a little bit more controversial or unscrupulous practices, similar to, in the text domain, just sort of blanket copying everything off the internet without sort of getting permission first. But this is a great example that if you wanted to use in class, you can be sure that it's sort of been done fairly to any rights holders that the music has been trained on. So here is some generative audio examples. So I wanted to give the same example to three different technologies. One is the Stability. Two others are the one that are currently being sued by the RIAA. This is an advocacy group. So feel free as you're listening to these if you want to read through this full text here. So here's the Stable Audio's take on that. So this is one example of this online course. I wish that we were all together in person so I could see your faces listening to that. The beat's great, but that second chord, boy, is pretty dissonant. Don't really think that would be something I'd be sitting on the beach listening to. I think I'd pick the next track. Now let's listen to Udio and Udio's take on this understated hip-hop, fresh keys, bassline, classic boom-back drums. Marked improvement over the Stable Audio in terms of musical coherence, in terms of form. You hear sort of very common formal build-ups that you'd hear in that sort of style of music. You hear different instrument timbres. There's clear sort of differentiation between there's like lead synths and a Fender Rhodes and your drums and bass. So they've used more music. They haven't licensed that music. See, they've sort of gained an advantage there, perhaps an unfair advantage, but an advantage nonetheless. And finally, this one is from Suno, and it sort of defaults to creating an instrumental, a song with lyrics. So there's also some lyrics in this one. Let's give it a listen and see what we think.
Sunshine on the streets, feel the summer heat, walking to the beach, shoes on my feet, windows how we glide. Bass keeps the fire, chillin' side by side. Good times never high. Summer nights so fly, stars align. Dancing in the moonshine.
again, I'd love to be able to talk to you all in person about this one. My thoughts on it, and I'm curious if you agree with me. It's not bad, but the lyrics are a bit trite. There's lots of end rhyme. It's very on the nose, right? It's sort of like what you'd expect, you know, someone with no songwriting experience, if they're just trying really hard to just do exactly what you told them to do, and sort of talk about the summer. There's not like a lot of depth or really extended metaphors or the things that we love our favorite songwriters that do. Musically, it kind of reminded me a little bit of like a Justin Timberlake, Timbaland kind of like, 2000s kind of approach. I didn't think it was bad. I didn't think it was terribly innovative. The audio quality, you could hear that there's some sort of computeriness to the vocals, but yeah, that's sort of my take on that one. That doesn't offend me, but I don't necessarily love it. But the fact that this is even possible at all is pretty incredible. So I don't think we can immediately write this technology off. I think doing so would be like in 1875 listening to a wax cylinder and saying, recorded music, that's going nowhere. That sounds terrible. I'd much rather go to hear a concert, right? I think we're hearing this technology in its earliest evolution, right? These products have only been around for a little more than a year. So I think there definitely is some consideration to be given here. Something that's really cool, I think also, I'm going to take my headphones off, is generative MIDI. And generative MIDI allows you to be more granular, right? So imagine a sort of bedroom producer, right? Someone who doesn't have a ton of traditional music experience, but really likes to program music, but struggles to kind of get chord progressions out, or maybe needs help getting melodies started. This is where generative MIDI can kind of come in and be a tool. So models are trained on large data sets of MIDI files, which contain symbolic musical information. For my talks with developers, the amount of data that's needed here is less, right? So you don't need millions of MIDI files. Maybe with 500 MIDI files or so, you could, all within the same style, you could start to get some musical coherence. So it's pretty interesting from a research standpoint. Generative MIDI applications create new musical phrases, chord progressions, full compositions. Applications geared towards music producers as a tool to overcome writer's block, simply generate new ideas. Lemonade.ai is a great example. One of the ones that's been sort of in the game the longest is Ava. I'm going to touch on Ava in my 2019 paper. One thing that you're going to try in the module that I think is super cool, because it has applications for every type of musician, be it instrumentalist, an aspiring jazz musician trying to do a transcription, a vocalist who doesn't have a backing track for a talent show, but needs to take an original recording with vocals and remove the vocals, a drummer who just wants to practice along with the band and practice keeping time, and so many more examples. Taking a mixed piece of audio and getting the drums, bass, other, which is typically guitars and keys, and vocals separated. This is indistinguishable from Magic 10 years ago. This was not possible in any shape. You could use EQ, you could use some phase alignment tricks to maybe get something, but to actually separate the instruments was like separating the cream from your coffee when it was already mixed in. It was not possible. So there's some really cool technologies. We'll explore it through Fader. I had some audio examples in here, but for time, I think I'll just keep things moving along. Why don't you go try this yourself? Use Fader, put some music up there. I put an MP3 down on D12, Billie Eilish, but you're welcome to use anything you like. Go ahead, try it for yourself. See what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts when you do your next assignment. Timbre transfer is another really cool one. You're also going to check this out in your assignment. The idea is that timbre transfer allows you to take one musical gesture, maintain that pitch, that rhythm, that expression, the volume, and then sort of place it on another instrument's tone. So you could say, let me take this drum kit recording and let me turn that into percussion, or percussion into drum kit. Or let me take this violin sound and turn it into, let's say, a saxophone. So the other thing that can be done with this is voices, right? You could say, let me, a producer with a, let's say how our students would say, a mid voice, like sound like a professional singer. So there's voice models of really good singers that have recorded, maybe a few hours of their singing, and then you could sing, play around with auto tune to get it in right intonation, and then voila, run it through a voice model, and you could sound like a professional singer. Would be great for getting a demo and getting a demo approved if you're trying to pitch something as a songwriter. So timbre transfer, I think, is a really cool example. I've used it in my own sort of music where I'm the guitar player primarily. I'm okay on keyboard. I'm not great on keyboard, but I found that using this in my own music was really cool and really powerful. I'll throw this up on the D2L just for time to keep the slides moving along. Feel free to check out this example. Yeah. So the last thing I want to kind of talk about is like, well, how did I approach these? And maybe you could take some of these ideas where I kind of broke these down into 6 sessions. One we did, where are we now? Experience and expectations of generative AI. So just talk to your students generally about AI, right? Have a talk like, hey, are you using this stuff? How are you using this stuff? What do you think of it? And then talk about sort of each of the topics. We could start with sort of like the generative AI and audio, just that's big and flashy and sometimes funny. So we started there. Then we looked at generative AI and symbolic or MIDI. We looked at Google Magenta and Ableton Live. We looked at Lemonade and some other things. In the next sessions, we were looking at remixing with AI. This was really fun, and something that I think would be cool for students of all ages is like being able to isolate vocals or drums and then creating mashups. So you could talk about maybe BPM or keys and helping students find songs that happen to be in the same BPM, the same key, and you could do some mashups with them. So remixing in AI is a great place to talk with students about this stuff. Timbre transfer was really cool too. We can do some listening. There's the voice models like Holly Plus and Elf Tech. There's tons of different resources. The Newtones Morpho is a really cool plugin that could be explored as well. And then finally, had the final session on sort of generative AI, the ethics and legal considerations about fair use. Is it fair use when a computer digests millions of songs and then is able in seconds to create songs that sound like those songs, even if don't have the same melody in a sort of traditional copyright sense, or use the same lyrics, right? Where is the line? I think it's a really good sort of discussion to have. So those are the sessions. And finally, I found these really interesting. These were some sort of student use case preferences. Like what did they seem to like? These are sort of undergraduate college students were a group responding. So it seemed like the STEM separation sort of had was the most popular with some preference also, they were not sure. They say, I'm not really sure yet. The jury's still out. And then sort of even split here between the MIDI and timbre transfer. Single purpose plugin versus multi-purpose web app. Did students like the web apps? Or would they want something that they could put into their existing workflow inside of Logic or inside of Ableton? It seemed like there was a slight preference towards that. Integration and production workflows. What is the likelihood that you use AI tools in your music production workflow next year? it was sort of and again an even split between likely use them but perhaps not regularly, and then not sure, and then if a few that said no, not for me. In your opinion, what will the impact of AI on musicians' their ability to earn a living from their music? So most said have had a somewhat negative impact, right? These students sort of picked up that they might be in direct competition with this, right? In an already flooded landscape where hundreds of thousands of tracks are uploaded to Spotify each day from distributors, like if there's even more music, it sort of dilutes the pool even more. So definitely it's something that future generations of musicians will have to think about, and that will have to organize to sort of make sure that independent musicians get a fair shake. So here's some of the key takeaways. Facilitating informed dialogues and encouraging experimentation are essential to help students discover the creative potential of generative AI. It is more important than ever that young artists to develop a unique voice and musical point of view. Financial success still hinges on building audiences and connections, not the quantity of music output. So there's no fast track to be, oh, I'm going to use AI and generate 1 million songs or generate 10 songs every day. It's really about the connections, right? It's not about the quantity of the musical output that guarantees success. And the backlash against consumer tier software can potentially eclipse the value of professional tools that could help up and coming musicians. So a lot of students that have seen Suno Audio and have a strong sort of reaction against that might make them sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and say, oh, I'm not going to do timbre transfer. I'm not going to do stem splitting. So it's important to sort of, help students develop nuanced opinions around these things so they can see both the positive and the negative of any technology of the scale of AI. So thank you. Definitely let me know, as always, if you have any questions, an email, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how you would approach teaching AI in your next assignment, your AI lesson plans. Definitely check the module out below, do some hands-on work with those 3 technologies, and thank you.